We're now moving on to the panel discussion, a very distinguished panel, led by a very distinguished chairman, Ian Buxton. The subject is, does the gin category need tighter definitions or not? And on the panel we have the distinguished and eminent Charles Maxwell, James Hayman, Olivier Ward, and Tarquin, we saw earlier, Tarquin Leadbetter. So over to you, Ian, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you to our master rectifier. Distinguished panel indeed. The distinguished panel have conferred, and we've decided you have to do quite a lot of work as well. We're looking for lots of audience interaction from the floor, lots of questions, we hope, lots of comments. I was making notes from Joanne Moore's presentation, and I wrote down one trenchant point, Joanne. I'm conscious of my juniper, you said. Otherwise, I'm making flavoured vodka. And that did seem to speak very much to our topic this morning. Does the gin category need tighter definitions or not? And what I thought we'd do is each of our panel members will make a brief statement, a very brief statement of their thoughts and positions on the topic. And then I very much want to throw this open to the floor and encourage debate, comment, and hopefully controversy. So I'm going to turn to my right to the eminent and distinguished.
I'm definitely looking right on this one, yeah.
Keep going to the right.
Somewhere over there.
Charles Maxwell, Thames Distillers, home of many a brand. Charles, what do you feel? Does the gin category need tighter definitions or not?
My belief, the short answer is no. I do not believe that as an industry we want to do what the Scotch whisky industry has done quite successfully, which is tie itself in knots where product innovation is very difficult. I do have one caveat on it. We have a regulation at the moment which says the flavour of juniper should be predominant. And that is the bit that, of course, it is totally unmeasurable when there's no measurement set. And I do think that actually going forward at some point, we ought to have a basis whereby that bit could be measured, but I would hate anything else to be regulated.
Thank you. The Scots have tied themselves in knots.
Yeah, well, quite frequently. They got Nicola Sturgeon.
Very topical to bring up Scotland's own tartan harpy. From one eminent and distinguished distiller, I'm going to pass to my extreme left, Tarquin, to a renegade newbie. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I guess so. 4 years, yeah.
Self-taught. So, from the southwest, Tarquin, does the gin category need tighter definitions or not?
I agree with Charles that the idea of being able to test the juniper level to hit that predominant definition, it would be brilliant. I'm not sure exactly how they do it. But I'm keen on that. But I also think that enforcement might be this issue. Who is the person or the authority which does it? Is it your local law? You know, for me, is it my Cornwall Council trading standards or environmental health inspector who carries out this testing? Does anyone have the knowledge to actually implement it? You know, is anything going to happen across the board? Are they going to set up an association? So it is quite, you know, there's a lot of grey areas. It would be nice to have products which don't taste like gin or juniper at all, not to be called gin. But I also agree in the sense that it's nice to have that experimentation where people are very much pushing the category to its boundaries and really developing and evolving gin as the fantastic spirit that it is.
Thank you. So we've got three distillers and one educator and commentator. Olivier, I think.
Fair enough.
Fair enough.
I think that's the appropriate title.
An eminent and distinguished commentator.
No, I'll take that.
He'll take that. Yeah. You'd be so lucky. Right. Tighter definitions.
Tighter definitions, adopted or abused. I definitely think gin is being abused. I don't think necessarily there needs to be more regulation. I do think there is absolutely a need for enforcement and policing of the issue. Currently, you can get away with pretty much anything you want to without anyone rapping your knuckles. And when I chastise people through editorial or even, talk about trading standards. I've raised it with trading standards. They're saying it's not their business. So I do think there does need to be some sort of enforcement, some sort of policing to make sure that the integrity of gin remains true to what it is. Does that require new legislation, not necessarily, but there perhaps needs to be some sort of ability to actually put a line in the sand and go, look, guys, as a community, we say that is enough is enough. I don't think there can be some much, even if it's just a start point that everyone would probably turn around, much like in other politics, everyone would probably turn around and say that's not far enough. It would be great to have that start point and just to be able to build from there and build something that isn't necessarily more regulated, but is self-regulated, and that doesn't lose the essence of what gin and what we all love about gin. The rate at which I'm seeing, most people won't recognise gin that was made 7 years ago, and we just tasted Orbium as just an example of this. When Hendrix first launched Hendrix, it was considered an outlier. It was one of those things that was way out there. But you taste it now, it's actually quite mainstream as a flavour profile, and Orbium is a little bit further out there. And so, you don't need to regulate yourself to the point where you restrict innovation, where you are overly regulated, and you allow the category to evolve. But at the same time, you need to make sure that the rate of evolution is in keeping, and we maintain the good things that we've earned and managed to make over the years.
Okay, thank you. I think there's going to be lots of jumping off points there, Olivier, so thank you. And finally, James, your family have been in the gin business for a few years.
Quite a long time, yeah.
Quite a long time. So I dare say you have some thoughts on the need for tighter definition or not.
I think there needs to be a bit more clarity. I think it's become quite wide now, and I'm all for innovation. We do it. We actually look backwards. We tasted the cordial gin earlier. But I think that we're maybe losing a little bit about what gin used to be, and that's something we've tried quite hard to protect. London Dry, what does that mean now? I was in Canada a few weeks ago, and people refer to London Dry, which is it is a London Dry by definition, but is it really true London Dry from what London Dry gin was back in time? Should London Dry now be a minimum of 40%, not 37.5%? It dropped down probably when vodka became quite dominant and as a way to compete with vodka. From a Hayman's point of view, Old Tom Gin is an important part of our portfolio. I'm very clear what Old Tom Gin is, but the question I get asked most is, what is Old Tom Gin? Because Old Tom Gin has changed since we first introduced it. Instead, if you look to America, Old Tom Gin in America is something very different to what we see English Old Tom to be. And I think that's really confusing. So you look at it from a consumer point of view, if you go and order a martini, and you're an English person, you're in Chicago, you order a martini and they serve you American gin, you're going to get quite a different drink to what you expect to have back at home. So I think it needs some clarity. I don't think it needs to be made too difficult. I don't think it needs to be too technical. But I think it just needs to be, there needs to be a bit more control over it. Who does it is a very difficult point, because the Gin and Vodka Association, which was disbanded maybe 7 years ago, roughly around that time, there's no one really there to do it now. And I think that's one of the problems. WSTA covers a very wide audience of different drinks, but no one was really there to protect gin. Obviously, the Gin Guild helps promote the gin category, but it's not there to govern gin. So a bit more clarity. Okay, thank you. Well, we've heard the views and the opening thoughts of the panel. One thing that seems to be coming up time and again is enforcement and who might this agency be. So actually put this question to the panel: do we need a new Gin and Vodka Association just to perform a SWA type of role? Tarquin, what would you say to that? A new Gin and Vodka body?
Potentially it could work, but it sort of goes back to what Charles says about more regulation. I mean, it would be nice for the local authorities to be able to do their job and actually know what they're doing, so trading standards can come around and they're well versed in the topics of different manufacturers, food and drink, and to be able to sort of enforce the law or EU law. But a whole new category, would we pay for it? Is it government? Who's going to fund it? And
I think we'll ask Diageo to fund it.
I think
pay for everything else.
Life as a small distiller, we're sort of tied up in endless red tape and bureaucracy, and something to minimise the increase any.
So on the one hand, red tape and bureaucracy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, consistent standards. And
Yeah.
Charles, where do you come out on that?
I think, what you need, if you're going to have it, the current regulation is woolly, and therefore it's very difficult. The flavour of juniper should be predominant. Well, I might say it is, and Jay might look at it and say, well, I don't think it is. And that's at the moment where we stand. You've actually got to you've got to put something down which will quantify that point. Then, and that's why trading standards won't go anywhere near it at the moment, because they don't know what to do. It's an impossible task for them. Not saying that they jump at every task you throw at them anyway. You've actually got to give somebody some measurement. Then you can say, okay, that's what the thing's got to be policed against. At that point, it gets policed by the government department, which is the trading standards.
Yeah, well, I wonder, Olivier, what do you think? Government intervention or industry-led? Do you see a role for a new gin association like the SWA, or would you rather leave it to the bureaucrats at the trading standards?
Both, but I think when you look at the, both or either, I'm not too fussed as to who would do it. The question is as what would they need in order to be able to do it? They'd actually need teeth. Because currently, when you can get chastised all you want with some people, you're like, so what? I'm going to carry on doing it. So you actually need someone who can who can implement punitive consequences for stepping out, and not necessarily in a super negative way, but you can actually have someone who you go, okay, well they said this, I need to fall in line because that's the way, and that's for better and for worse. SWA do actually. When they issue statements and they do start it, people do tend to move. You'd also need them widely funded. You talk about Diageo, you'd actually need the big boys to be funding it, as well as the smaller craft distilleries to endorse it. So actually people like the Gin Guild probably a good organisation because they are well funded from the big four with a large blank cheque, as well as have community-wide, but have community-wide endorsement. So there is, yes, celebrating and promoting the category, but protecting it too. In the opening remarks, we heard those two statements. And so potentially protecting it might actually mean taking a stance, and taking a stance will be unpopular, and therefore you need both the ability to financially do that as well as the support to be able to do that from within the community. And so whether trading standards only has the stick or whether someone like the Guild has the carrot and the stick, it doesn't really matter. It's just so long as someone's doing it, it will be a much better place for it.
So I think the Gin Guild will be fascinated to know that they're handsomely funded.
Well, I don't think we've got blank cheques from anybody. As far as I know, we haven't.
The SWA, of course, are protected by the force of law in European legislation. And James, you talked a little bit about the problem of consumer confusion. Would you like to see punitive penalties, as Olivier suggested, in law?
Well, making it happen, I think, is quite challenging. Looking at trading standards, I don't think they've got the expertise to know, really. They can test the strength of a product, but to ask them to go and decide whether it's a gin or not, I think is going to push them beyond what they're able to do. And I think in this climate, that's not going to happen. So it probably needs to be some sort of national association.
Industry.
Yeah, and it could be a guide. Maybe it's a guide to start with. Maybe it doesn't need to be so tough that it needs to be about law. I mean, just a guide of where gin should go. There's a lot of people creating gins at the moment. A lot of people probably here today, and probably a guide on where gin should sit would maybe help them. I mean, maybe some people from the audience might better answer that question.
Okay, yeah, and at that point, I think we will open it up to your comments and questions, and certainly, sir, over there.
Ian, I think there's two stages to this. First, I think, is blind tasting. Of the 7 products that we've just tasted, there were 2 that if I was tasting them blind, I would not have known were gins. And I think somewhere down that route, we can start to clarify which products are going beyond the band and are no longer gin. I think the second thing is the WSTA is established to handle regulation for gin, and it's up to the members, including myself, to pressurise that organisation to do its job. But I think the industry has got to go to WSTA and say this is the way we think the measurement should be done, and I can only see blind tasting by knowledgeable people as being the way that we can get there.
Yeah, but I guess implicit in the the line beyond the bounds is exactly where the bounds lie. And, you know, those 2 of the 7 that you've tasted, I'm sure, would maintain that they offer a gin. But WSTA could fulfill a role. Certainly that's a proposition. Any other? Yes, sir.
I actually have a slight interest in this area and had a phone conversation with the EPI EU 110/2008, which is the clause that says that juniper has to be predominant. When I spoke to the lady who looks over that and governs what that definition is, she said, well, why would you do that? Why would you make a gin that doesn't taste of juniper? I said, well, because you sell more of it. But then surely the industry, the people wouldn't buy it, but it doesn't taste of juniper as much. So therefore, it's going to be more like pineapple gin than just saying it's really a gin. The other thing, I also had a conversation with the SWA. They said it was more to do with education, as you say, at the point of saying, rather than having it as written in law, which you can, unless you make it a DO, a designated origin, like champagne or the other ones, that's a hugely expensive and costly and time-consuming process. Really, it's better to go from finding out, like say, using taste patterns and sensory, and then going from there, from the application of science, and then educating distillers moving forward, rather than being a big stick where you
Okay, well, let's pick up that point about education, because I think that's very interesting. And I wonder, James, do you think, could the industry do more? Should the industry do more for educating the consumer?
Well, I think the industry do a lot more than they did 10 years ago. I think there's lots more masterclass, and Joanne mentioned it earlier, that a huge amount more is done. Can we do more? Of course we can always do more. I think the category's growing, but everybody probably does it their own way. If I'm doing a masterclass on Hayman, my masterclass is directed towards Hayman, it's not necessarily directed towards gin. Each individual gin brand will probably go down their own route and promote the gin they make as the way gin should be made. Is there an organisation that should do more about gin as a whole? I think the WSET do a little bit, but I don't think it's a huge amount, so it may be, but whether it's up to the brands to do it or someone else, it's open to debate.
Olivier, you do a lot of work in this field. Is there a need for a common standard, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. You know, like, and I've talked to other commentators, bloggers, and writers about whether it would be useful if even just all of us were to use a similar terminology consistently. Because if we as media do that, then of course, you know, I have 100,000 unique users that land on our website every single month. So of course, inevitably, yes, we are an interface for consumers. But there are, just coming back onto the subjective things that how much is this and who would be able to do it? There are loads of non-subjective things that we could all agree on. You know, we talk about the base being 96. There are many people who blatantly disregard that rule and still put gin on their label. There are many people calling their London Dry with way too much sugar on there. We're talking about 500 gins earlier on, 2,000. You're saying much more than that, because there are over 1,000 distillers in the US making it. I mean, I think 500 gins is you're almost just you. I'm joking. But there are so many out there, and yeah, sure, we're talking about the 1 percentile that are doing it currently, and that there's so few who are actually blatantly disregarding something. But it's an easy place to start now, and it will become an increasingly bigger problem when all of a sudden you have actually big brands clearly not respecting rules and terminology and stuff like that, and then applying it, and then it becomes an issue that's actually quite a big issue to solve. And at the moment it's a relatively easy issue to solve, because there are very, very few people in the wider context of it, even though we're talking dozens, maybe several dozens within the UK. It's not that hard to deal with right now.
Actually, that leads me to a thought, and I'm going to put this to Charles. It isn't 500, but what's your just hypothetically, if someone came along to you with an idea, with a recipe, with a concept they wanted you to make that really did push it beyond the bounds, what's your response to that as a contract distiller?
My response is, we're more than happy to make it, but they can't call it gin, or we will not sell it as gin to them. Botanical flavoured spirits, a lovely marketing term that rolls off the tongue. Right. I think the consumer will jump into that straight away. But no, I mean, we have a very straight rule that it's got to pass us on the basis that we regard juniper as being predominant, and provided it complies with all the other, then it can be called London Dry or distilled gin. But beyond that, then we went, they've either got to find somebody else or rename the product.
May I ask, sorry,
Yeah,
John,
yeah.
ask, would you then sell a product, you said you wouldn't sell it to them as a gin, would you sell it to them as a botanical flavoured vodka, knowing that they would then apply gin to the label?
I would try and persuade them not to provide, I mean, if I thought
But
they were
push comes to
flavoured,
shove, you would.
But push comes to shove. No, well, I would like to, at the moment, I'd say no, we
Yeah,
won't,
you wouldn't,
because we
because you don't
don't
need
do
to.
it. So, there is always that nasty commercial world, I suppose. Somebody waves a really big check at you, but I think I'd say no tends to. We have a certain standing in the marketplace. I think people, what we produce, people accept, and I wouldn't want to. We could endanger, and that's the thing. If people do this, if they push it too far, the consumer eventually get twigs to an SATS product, and B, your reputation and it's very easy to destroy your reputation.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you have that saying, but there are other craft distillers who are now taking on third-party contracts distilling, and there are some in South Africa who make fantastic grain-to-glass products, who then also make essentially flavoured vodkas, and who have found that problem, but they took it on, and I think it's you have a reputation, that is your business. Whereas that there are other people who go, well, people know me for my gin, I can be respected for this. It's for someone else, it doesn't matter as much. It's okay. I can just let them. They're the ones who are actually doing it. I'm just the one making it.
Just make it.
I think that's going to be a massive issue as absolving yourself from a moral perspective as a third-party maker from the end product, even though technically speaking you don't own the brand, so it's quite difficult. That's a really grey area that's going to keep on growing in complexity.
James, what's your take on that as a distiller? Presumably people approach you to...
Yeah, we don't make third-party gin, so it's fairly
academic.
It's fairly easy for us, but if we did, I would try and govern it. Yeah.
So there's a sort of self-regulation.
Yeah. But I understand it from Charles's point of view. His business is about contracting, so he looks at it from a different angle. If someone comes with a great opportunity and they've got well-funded, good marketing plans, then it's probably hard for him to say no, I guess.
Right. So, Tarquin, just turn back to you, and from the smaller scale.
Yeah, I was thinking about this and whether the problem or these blurred lines really comes from the small producers, where the brands aren't well known enough for anyone to have a problem with it. And obviously, perhaps the biggest brands lead by example, but unless there's a huge global international brand which really isn't gin, and everyone's saying it, maybe nothing's really going to happen. And these blurred lines at the small end of the market, or the craft end, are perhaps helping to boost the category in terms of suppliers. Lots of people can get on board. The gin category is growing. There's growth. Tax revenues, the tax coffers have been lined to an extent. And unless there's any sort of a real problem of a big brand, perhaps nothing will happen really.
Right. So when you were self-taught,
Yeah.
what was it that encouraged you to stick within the rules, to stick to the bounds, and make gin and not make, as it would be called, flavoured vodka or botanical spirit?
Well, the more I trialed and tested different botanicals and flavours, I was naturally drawn back to the more classic gins that I knew, and that was gin to me. So my understanding of gin were these classical London dry traditional gins, and that's what I was very much drawn to. I didn't want to make something really odd or single botanical-esque in terms of flavour. I wanted gin to be the lead, and so our flagship dry is a sort of contemporary take on a classic, and that's just my. That's what I like. So I made what I wanted.
In a word, it's a word that's been used a couple of times on the panel already. Integrity.
Perhaps, yeah. Well, I like gin, so I wanted to make a gin. It would be. We do make some limited editions, and perhaps to an extent we can test the boundary of the category with these, I say, single botanical expressions. So perhaps like an elderflower gin, or where there is a botanical which you could say is side by side dominant, or perhaps more predominant than the juniper, and that's where you can get into sort of that grey area. But at the same time, it's arguably pushing the category to an extent. I still want to make gin at the heart of it, but
Okay.
I think
We've got a question from the floor. Yes, sir?
Instead of forcing everything in 3 or 4 categories, do you see any establishment of subcategories like in the craft beer scene, where you have still beer with different recipes and different flavor profiles? Would you see a possibility in the regulation on that?
Oh, well, that may be, yeah. Would that help us, gentlemen, do you think, to have defined subcategories that let through perhaps 2 of the 7? Charles, is there a role for a subcategory?
I find I mean, it's one of those, I think it's very difficult because where you haven't got something, I mean, with gin there is an established point, there's history and all the rest of it. Subcategory, you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and where do you draw the boundaries? You know, what boundaries are they going to be?
Again.
You can only really start drawing something once you've got some sort of market that people can aim at. I mean, basically, if you drop out of gin, you drop what to spirit drink, which covers anything and everything, basically, as long as it's alcoholic and over about 20%. At that point, I mean, the main reason some of the people are using gin is because if you go and see somebody and you say, "What have I? You know, I've come here to sell you something. What are you selling?" "I'm selling gin." Well, the buyer immediately has got you a nice little pigeonhole. "Yeah, I've got this, and I want to put these number of gins. Does your product fit in with what I want?" "Yes, I'll stock it." I arrive and say, "I've got a botanical flavoured spirit." The buyer says, "Where the bloody hell am I going to put that? What category are you trying to put me into?" And that's it. I mean, buyers and trade, quite reasonably, they've got categories they want to put the products they're buying into. So it's a much bigger challenge to sell a botanical flavoured spirit.
So yeah, the spirit drink category is a bit of a bucket, really. Okay, I've got lots of hands, so we're going to go back over to Harriet Watt.
Are we on the dawn of the age of the Olivier, the time we sort of actually made that the fertile kind of playground for all of the gin, not gin, so you do whatever, not whatever you like, but so you then take it like a professional relief valve from learning the lessons from gin, and then taking them out and then throwing it wide and let people have an experiment and play.
Okay, well, we've got one eye on the clock, so we'll have very quick 1- and 2-word answers from my panels. And I've got to turn to somebody who made Cornish Pasties, for goodness sake, and say, what about eau de vie?
I think I agree with Charles. You need that pigeonhole. So on a bar menu, it's as simple as, you know, where am I going to put it? And when you're facing the trade, that is the biggest problem. And it's, you know, you don't need to reinvent. You can't trying to reinvent the wheel in spirit categories. I make pastis. Not many people drink pastis. It's quite difficult. It's funny, but it's quite difficult to sell. And we don't sell that much of it compared to our gin. It's a nice product to have in our range, but you know, you are really it's fighting. You know, it's walking up fighting against a brick wall really with some of these things. Trying to get people to drink stuff that they've never drunk before is a challenge.
There's an image. Fighting against a brick wall. James, what about eau de vie? Yes or no?
No, I mean, I'm with Charles. I think gin is gin. I think every gin distiller makes a gin that's their style, and I think you become recognised for that style. So I don't think that you want necessarily gin producers having a wide range of number of styles. So I would say no.
All right, thumbs down to that. I've got David keen for a question.
Thanks for totally disagreeing with you there, James. I think that to an extent the question about subcategorization, yes, I totally get that there needs to be what gin is, and then from that, because to an extent we have that already as an example with Old Tom and things like that. Things have changed from when I started getting into gin. Like, we didn't have contemporary gin. It wasn't a concept that was known. And yes, there's things like Western and that, and there's some overlap, and it's not it's not 100% clear, but that is terminology that I do hear when I'm speaking to distillers, and I do see retailers using it. So I think it's a discussion that we've had on the previous panel where Waitrose are using that sort of terminology. So, and certainly judging, when you look at judging, most international competitions now have a section for that contemporary style of gin. So I think that language is an important thing. The good thing about perhaps looking at it from a language and that point of view is it's slightly easier to do. I mean, talking about organisations or other organisations or getting different agencies to do stuff is tricky. Getting some people together and having a discussion about language and possibly doing something with styles and things like that, and some unofficial guidelines, so not a legal thing, but just for people, just to help people that are thinking about making gin, that's something that we can do, and that's something that we can do relatively easily. And I think it's important. I think the point that Olivier was making, it's important to do something to start it rather than just well, ideally we do this, but it's never going to happen.
Okay, so we need some guidance from somebody. But I know there's another question here. Yes, sir.
I think innovation in gin brings a lot of new people into the category, and so this is good for them, obviously. And maybe we ought to make the London Dry the gold standard of gin, which it once used to be, I think, and maybe set the rules to then make it only Spurs to have London Gin on top.
Right, yeah, now that's, I'm going to come to you, James. There's a question we're going to go to at the back in a moment, but James, you spoke a little bit about London Dry, and should it be 40%? Is the consumer confused? What about London Dry as the gold standard?
Well, I think my point from London Dry is that you can buy London Dry for £10 or £30, so how does the consumer understand that? I've got friends and, do they go, oh, we bought that one because it's cheaper. Now, is it better? And some want to know, some don't want to know. I think London Dry, obviously the definitions were put in place back in the 90s. I think probably as gin was fighting against vodka. I just think it's time to review it. I think gin's changed so much in the last 10 years. It doesn't mean you can't have gin at 37.5, because a lot of people do, and it works well for them. But I think London Dry is just becoming really diluted, and actually that's what gin used to be. And that's a shame. See, a lot of new gins coming out now, they've just got gin on them, or you say Cornish dry gin, I think it is. But London Dry gin is where, there's a huge history behind London Dry gin. I'm not saying that it should just be made in London. I think that would be too difficult. But I think maybe it's just worth tightening up a little bit what London Dry gin stands for. And maybe that does really become the benchmark.
Okay, interesting. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I want London Dry Gin to be made back in London.
Back in London.
I have a small interest in this.
So do I.
Joe's just about to kill me.
I'm very happy, actually.
You're very happy on that?
As long as we do it from about November time, I'm with you, Charles.
We can wait till...
So that wouldn't be any sort of a Scotch whisky knot to tie yourself in any way, shape or form.
As far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. There's a gentleman in a shirt at the very back of the room.
Very quick comment, I suppose, about the, is there a need for a new, there are regulations out there, so it's the question about, enforcement of those regulations that are there, and we're not going to answer that in this room today. But I suppose, in terms of, if you think of the pineapple gin, the different riffs on gin, they're going to end up with pineapple gin to start off with things like slow gin, which are very traditional. You've got to accommodate all of those. So, is there a need for a new category, a new definition for flavoured gin, which, like gin, by definition, starts off with ethyl alcohol of agricultural origin? Should flavoured gin start off with gin that meets the gin definition, and then whatever you want to do with it, then it fits into the flavoured gin category? So that allows the guy who's got something.
Which sort of brings us back into our subcategory debate, really. Do we?
It's flavoured gin and it starts off with gin.
Right.
So they can do something to it.
Do something.
The question for enforcement and I suppose voluntary code of conduct or whatever, maybe that's for another day.
So no vodka would ever say we're a flavoured vodka. I think even when they were like, popcorn flavoured vodka, they would call themselves, they wouldn't go like, they wouldn't put, so I think you'd really struggle to get someone to write flavoured gin on there, even though if there was a subcategory. But I don't think innovation has to come at the expense of heritage. That in terms of the sample deck that we had there, number one, that was her nose. That was progressive, that was interesting, that was new, that was something different, but it was still gin. There's a lot of diversity, and we talk about overlapping Venn diagrams of flavours. There's an enormous amount of flavour, and there's a whole 180 spectrum that you can actually have within gin without walking away from the category's heritage. So you can still innovate. It's just this constant need to tap into something that isn't gin and rely on gin's credibility in order to sell it.
Thank you. I'm keeping one eye on the clock because we promised to finish at 10:02, and I see there's one question at the back, but I'm interested about this idea of heritage because, as David's proven earlier on today, if you dig hard enough in old magazine adverts, you can find even a heritage for that pineapple gin. Heritage is where you seek and you shall find, perhaps. Now I'm going to go one more question, the gentleman at the back, and then we faithfully promised we'd wrap up. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Really quick question.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, we can do that in super quick fashion. What are our thoughts left to right on Damson gin on the label?
I'm happy with Damson gin.
He's happy with Damson gin. James?
Yeah, happy.
Happy.
Put it under the fruit category. Quince gin's not a category either. Ferdinand Saar had to move. Unless Damson gin becomes a category, you should move to.
Can't have damson gin. It's got to be damson flavoured, either
Yeah.
gin made with damson. But yeah, I mean, the only one that's there is sloe gin. That's in the regulation.
But then everything else
Unfortunately.
becomes fruit
Yeah.
gin.
There it comes fruit gin. And there we split, and sadly, ladies and gentlemen, there I feel we must leave it. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to my eminent and distinguished panel.